He was known as the Tyrant of Terror, and he was in charge of a period of time in France in which around 17,000 people were executed in a matter of months. The method of execution was the French guillotine, the slanted blade device which took the heads off the King and Queen of France, and Robespierre was the man in charge of the period known as the Reign of Terror, and people in France feared a great deal. If they uttered any words which were said to have been in support of the monarchy, they would be dragged to their executions quickly. Some wives of men who lost their heads wept as they saw their loved ones being executed, and their tears were then said to have been a sign of support for those considered traitors, and I bet you can guess what happened to their wives. But Maximilian Robespierre himself flew too close to the sun, and the architect of the terror himself was executed on the guillotine. But today his remains have been lost, and he is buried along with thousands of others underground inside of Paris. But what happened to his head? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Maximilian Robespierre was born in 1758 in Arras, in northern France. Trained as a lawyer, he developed a reputation for honesty and dedication to justice. When the French Revolution began in 1789, he was quickly elected to the Estates General, and he emerged as a skilled speaker and a man of principle. He became known for defending the rights of the poor, opposing slavery, and demanding equality before the law. Unlike many revolutionaries, Robespierre lived modestly. He avoided the corruption and wealth that tempted others, and his personal integrity earned him the nickname the Incorruptible. His influence grew with the radical Jacobin Club, and as France descended into war, rebellion and chaos, Robespierre presented himself as the guardian of the revolutionary virtue. By 1793, after the execution of King Louis XVI, Robespierre had become one of the leaders of the Committee of Public Safety, the body that effectively ruled France during the most violent phase of the revolution. The committee oversaw the war effort, internal security, and the economy, and it also unleashed the period that became known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror, from 1793 to 1794, was a time of extraordinary violence. Revolutionary tribunals condemned thousands of people to death by the guillotine. Some were aristocrats and royalists, but many were ordinary citizens accused of disloyalty, hoarding, or spreading counter-revolutionary ideas. The guillotine in Paris became a symbol of the revolution, and the blade fell daily. Robespierre justified these executions as necessary to save the Republic. He argued that terror combined with virtue was the only way to defend liberty against traitors and enemies. His speeches often invoked lofty ideals, insisting that France was on a mission to create new and just society. But in practice, the terror bred fear and suspicion. Anyone could be accused, and few were safe. The guillotine claimed not only royalists but also revolutionary leaders themselves. Rivals of Robespierre, such as Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, were denounced and executed. This ruthless elimination of opponents made Robespierre both powerful and feared, but it also isolated him. By the mid-1794, he seemed increasingly alone, standing above others as the arbiter of life and death. One of Robespierre's most controversial acts was his attempt to replace traditional religion with what he called the cult of supreme being. Robespierre, though opposed atheism, believed the revolution needed a more foundation rooted in civic virtue and belief in a higher power. In June of 1794, he staged a grand festival in Paris celebrating the supreme being. Robespierre himself led the procession, dressed in a bright blue coat, looking every inch the high priest of his new faith. Many of his colleagues saw this as arrogance, even madness, and it gave the impression that Robespierre was setting himself up as a moral dictator, controlling not just politics but the very soul of the French citizens. For men already weary of the terror, this was deeply unsettling. By the summer of 1794, Robespierre's position was precarious. The Revolutionary Tribunal continued its deadly work, but support for the terror was crumbling. The war against France's external enemies was turning in France's favour, making mass executions less justifiable. Ordinary citizens were exhausted by fear and shortages, and within the National Convention, deputies feared they might be next to fall under Robespierre's accusations. Robespierre, however, did not back down, and on July 26, 1794, 8 Thermidor, year 2 in the revolutionary calendar, he delivered a long speech before the convention. In it, he denounced corruption and hinted at new lists of traitors who deserved punishment, but, crucially, he did not name them. This uncertainty terrified the deputies. Many suspected they were on his secret list. Instead of uniting the convention, Robespierre's speech convinced them that he had become a tyrant. The next day, July 27th, events moved quickly. Robespierre tried to speak again in the convention, but his enemies shouted him down. The deputies, led by men such as Tallien and Billiard Varan, accused him of dictatorship. A vote was taken, and Robespierre, his brother Augustin, and close allies St. Just were declared outlaws. When National Guardsmen loyal to Robespierre tried to rally in Paris, confusion spread. For years, Robespierre had terrified his colleagues, but now that he was outlawed, supporting him seemed dangerous. The tide turned against him, and that evening forces of the convention stormed the Hôtel de Ville where Robespierre and his supporters had gathered. The capture of Robespierre was chaotic. During the raid, he was badly injured. Accounts differ on how. Some say he attempted suicide with a pistol, but only managed to shatter his jaw, and others claim he was shot by soldiers. Whatever the truth, he was then unable to speak, and his jaw was bandaged in agony. His brother Augustin jumped from a window in despair, and he broke his legs. The man who had once stood as the voice of the revolutionary virtue now appeared pitiful and broken. He was taken along with his allies to the cells where so many of their victims had waited before execution. Then on July 28, 1794, Robespierre and 21 of his closest allies were condemned without a trial. There was no need for a lengthy proceeding. As outlaws, they were considered guilty automatically. That afternoon, the tumbrils carried them through Paris to the guillotine at the Place de la Révolution. Crowds gathered to witness the downfall of the incorruptible. Many had feared him, others hated him, and most were simply eager to see justice done. Unlike earlier executions where the crowd had sometimes shown sympathy, the atmosphere was hostile. It was said that most of the watchers fixed their gaze on the cart in which Robespierre, his brother, Caution and Henry were riding. These miserable creatures were all mutilated and covered with blood. They looked like a band of brigades, and the gendarmes had surprised in the forest and were unable to arrest without inflicting serious wounds upon them. It would be difficult to describe the appearance of Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty, blood-stained linen, and his features were horribly disfigured. A pale pallor made it even more repulsive. He kept his eyes downward and almost closed. Whether that was from the pain of his wounds or the awareness of his misdeeds, one cannot say. And just before arriving at the place of execution, Robespierre was shaken out of his lethargy by a woman who forced her way through the crowd and rushed up to the cart, carrying this cannibal. She grasped the cart rail with one hand and threatened Robespierre with the other, saying, "Monster spewed from hell, the thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes and looked at her sadly as she said, "Go now, evildoer. Go down into your grave, carrying the curses of the wives and mothers of France." When the cart had reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried the tyrant down and laid him out prone until it was his turn for execution. While his accomplices were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared not to be taking notice. He kept his eyes shut and did not open them until he himself was carried to the scaffold. Some say that when he saw the instrument of death, he heaved a sigh of pain, but before dying he had to endure bitter suffering. After having thrown down his coat, The executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint which the surgeon had put on his wounds. This unhinged his lower jaw from the upper jaw and caused the blood to flow in torrents. The wretched man's head was now no more than an object of horror and repulsion. When at last it was severed from his body and the executioner held it by hair to show the people, it presented an indescribably horrible sight. Thus perished the fiercest of the savage beasts, the most monstrous criminal that nature ever conceived. On the 2 days that followed, 83 other rebels were put to death, mainly members of the Commune or their outlawed accomplices. Following the execution, the remains of Robespierre were collected and were placed inside of a coffin, including his head. This was placed between his legs to symbolise that Robespierre died in disgrace, and that the coffin was then taken to the Arancis cemetery, a newly established cemetery at the time that was dealing with the enemies of the revolution. A mass grave was dug, and Robespierre's coffin was thrown in the grave, along with a number of his associates who were also executed that day. But that would not be the final resting place for his remains and his head. Between 1844 and 1859, most probably in the year 1848, the remains of Robespierre and the others buried in the Arancis cemetery were moved into the catacombs in Paris, the underground mausoleum and ossuaries, and in there the remains were deposited along with millions of other people's bodies. Because of this, it's impossible to identify the remains of Robespierre, and they remain somewhere inside of the catacombs, but no one knows where. This also includes the rest of his remains, including his skeletal remains, and parts of the former tyrant may have been split up to be arranged in certain ways inside of the catacombs. Today these underground tunnels hold the story to the head of Robespierre and where his head truly is today. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.